Hello everyone, and today I'm going to present on the powerful idea called Nirvana and how it relates to Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So even though each of these religions explain it in its own way, they all see Nirvana as a way to end human suffering and reach spiritual freedom. So in this presentation, I will break down simply and clearly how Nirvana relates to each of these religions, as well as its similarities and differences, and finally how it relates to suffering and evil, which is the topic of our class. So down to the core concept, what is Nirvana? So it is a core concept in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Nirvana is overall the main goal, even though each religion understands it differently. So the word nirvana originates from Sanskrit, which means blowing out or extinguishing, kind of like blowing out a candle. But it doesn't mean death, which one might think. Spiritually, it means ending pain, desire, and the cycle of being born and dying again, which is called rebirth, a word that you often see pop up in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. But they all kind of mean slightly different things. Lastly, nirvana is the pursuit of understanding oneself, the karma, rebirth, and liberation that we all kind of go through within our lives. So, nirvana in Hinduism. A synonym with nirvana is moksha, which is the release from the cycle of rebirth or samsara. Hindus believe that each person has a soul called Atman, which is actually part of a greater spirit called Rahman, which I'm probably butchering these words. When someone truly understands this, they can be free. And there are different paths to reach moksha, like gaining spiritual knowledge, showing love and devotion to God, or doing good actions without being selfish. So in the PowerPoint, I have examples such as karma yoga, brahakti yoga, and jnana yoga. So a selfless action, devotion, and knowledge and insight. Hinduism, ancient scripture, has always emphasized self-realization and detachment of oneself from material desires. The idea of nirvana in Hinduism is the affirmation of a spiritual being. It's not disappearing, but becoming one with the divine. Next is nirvana in Buddhism. So Buddhism's foundation is on something called the Four Noble Truths. These say that life involves dukkha or suffering, and this suffering is caused by tanha or craving. Nirvana is the end of that suffering, and Buddhists follow the eightfold path, which includes right view thinking, good intentions, speech, action, living a good livelihood, what effort you put in, your mindfulness, and your concentration in life. One big difference from Hinduism is that Buddhists don't believe in a permanent soul. So instead, they teach Atman or no self. So nirvana in Buddhism is not about becoming one with God. It's about letting go of ego and desires completely. And on that note, it's important to follow the 5 principles of Buddhism. So the principle of mindfulness, the principle of karma, the principle of non-self, of suffering, and impermanence. So the doctrine of Atman, so no permanent self, distinguishes Buddhism from Hinduism. Like I mentioned earlier, Nirvana is ultimate peace and freedom from that cycle of samsara. So those are the 5 principles of Buddhism. Really does show the big difference between Nirvana and Buddhism and Hinduism, and even as a religion itself. So last but not least is Nirvana in Jainism. Jainism also uses the word moksha for nirvana, but in Jainism the soul is called jiva. which is real and permanent. So Jain teachings say that the soul is pure but gets covered with karma like dust. This karma comes from things we do, say, and even feel. Nirvana happens when the soul gets completely clean and rises to the top of the universe. This is achieved through strict and ethical conduct, which includes the non-violence, truth, and non-possessions of material objects, for example. The liberated soul exists in a state of omniscience and bliss at the top of the universe, where it's forever in a state of peace, wisdom, and joy. Jainism asserts the soul is inherently pure but bound by karma accumulated through actions and passions that we live in our day-to-day life. The karma is just kind of a part of life. And the path to nirvana is marked by, the renunciation and kind of the holy grail of life once reached. So, what are the key differences among these religions and their traditions within them? Hinduism sees nirvana as a union with Brahman. So, nirvana means realizing your soul is the same as the divine. In Buddhism, there sees it as an assertion of self and suffering, meaning letting go of the idea of a soul and ending suffering. And finally, Jainism as the release of soul from karmic bondage. So freeing your soul from karma and reaching this perfect state because you are born with that karma kind of wrapped around you. Each religion does have its own view of self or no self and its own way to reach that nirvana, but it is the same kind of central idea. So paths differs, and kind of my points here on the PowerPoint is devotional and physiological in Hinduism. Buddhism is definitely more of an ethical approach, and Jainism is more moral of how you get that karma off of your soul. Even with these differences, these religions share some big values. Overall, I think it's important to know that they teach kindness, self-control, and respect for life. They ask people to, let go of that greed, anger, and ego that we're kind of born with. And they believe that deep peace and wisdom come from within, not from outside the world. So everything that you do to reach nirvana is within, and you are the only person that can kind of achieve that. And in so many ways, nirvana is really just becoming the best version of yourself, kind, wise, and free, and the path to that through these, traditions within the religions. So nirvana and the idea of problem of suffering and even the idea with evil, all three religions agree that life includes suffering. It's just kind of part of human nature, as we might put it, but people are stuck in a cycle of being born, suffering, and then dying. So that's kind of the process of rebirth, like I mentioned earlier. And nirvana is the escape from this cycle. So suffering is usually caused by desire, ignorance, or karma. And through this, you have Buddhism that explicitly starts with the Four Noble Truths, diagnosing suffering and prescribing nirvana as the cure. You have Hinduism that sees suffering as a due of ignorance of one's true self, where liberation can occur through the enlightenment and detachment of, so-called material things. And Jainism views suffering as, caused by karmic particles in which we're kind of born with. While these religions don't necessarily talk about evil the way that other religions, such as Christianity, do, they all say people suffer because of their own actions, thoughts, and misunderstandings that are surrounded by them within the world. So evil can be seen as a consequence of ignorance and attachment rather than a metaphysical entity, as maybe some of the other religions might explain it as. Just to conclude that, nirvana is the way to live in peace and overcome these problems. So the goal is to not interact with suffering and evil, which is, I think, we're all in the moment hope to never go through, suffering and evil are two things that nobody likes in their life. And through these traditions within the religions, no one wants to live like that anymore. And that's kind of the true purpose of nirvana, no matter what you believe and how you get to it. So in conclusion, nirvana is a powerful goal within Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. They may all mean different things, but in every case, it offers a way out of suffering and evil and into freedom. So all traditions value that detachment, moral discipline, and inner purification that we as humans are trying to fight every day. So, especially with Jainism, the ethical conduct, nonviolence, truthfulness, and self control is foundational to who you are as a person and the way that you live as well. These religions give us kind of ancient wisdom about how to live a better life, and they all agree that peace comes from within. So, nirvana is not merely an intellectual goal, but a transformation of one's being and consciousness. It represents the highest human potential and kind of beating the suffering and rebirth cycle that are within all of these religions. So whether you call it nirvana, moksha, or liberation, the journey is about growing wiser, kinder, and more awake. And so despite, doctrinal differences within all of these religions, their traditions all kind of promote that transcendence of ego and desire in which we are kind of born with. And that concludes my presentation on nirvana and how it relates to all three of these religions, as well as the suffering and evil. And I hope I let you guys learn a little bit more about nirvana and kind of clearly show the differences as well as the similarities of how people live their lives to reach this one goal. Thank you.